Okay, so today what I'm going to try and do is go through some of the survey questions that we asked you last time at the end, and trying to illustrate some of the topics and some of the issues of behavioral economics using those survey answers, and trying to give you a better or more precise overview of what kinds of topics are we going to talk about. As you know, this survey was anonymous. Somebody was asking, do we need ethical or IRB approval for that? We take ethical issues, in fact, very seriously in all of the studies that we're doing. The answer to that is, like, since the survey was anonymous and there was sort of no personally identifiable information collected, it's okay to do that, in particular in situations where arguably nobody is harmed from answering those types of questions. The surveys, you might sort of say, that's not a particularly rigorous sort of experiment or survey. That's exactly right. So the survey that we're asking, in some sense, provides some, suggestive evidence of, like, some of the behavioral issues that are going on. A lot of the evidence that I'm going to show you in class are much more rigorous in terms of, like, actual much more rigorous experimentation. That's kind of hard for me to do in a short survey. So you think of these evidence that I'm showing you sort of as suggestive, and then I'm going to show you more rigorous evidence that those kinds of phenomena, in fact, also holding once you sort of do things more rigorously. Okay. So now, when you think about how do economists think about human behavior, there's sort of broadly three aspects in which you can think about that. The first one is, or broadly speaking, we have sort of constrained optimization, where people have a utility function, which is kind of like specifying in some mathematical form of what makes people happy. Right? There's stuff in the world, consumption and so on, that goes into the utility function. You can eat apples, bananas, and so on, and essentially the more of those you eat, usually the happier you are, which economists sort of have construed as like a concept called utility. Higher utility is good, and it sort of specifies what makes people happy. Now, there are sort of like different aspects to that. You can think of this as, like, there's the instantaneous utility function, and I should have said in recitation we're going to discuss sort of a review of sort of utility maximization. If you have taken, like, 1401, 1403, 1404 and sort of are very familiar with this kind of material, you might want to skip recitation this week. Future recitations will be much more general and specific to the class. But so what makes people happy is essentially two things. One is sort of there's an instantaneous utility function, which is kind of like at this moment in time what makes you happy, or on a specific day. Often it's sort of defined on a daily basis or even yearly basis at a specific sort of period or moment in time what makes you happy. That's sort of the instantaneous utility function. And then there's sort of like time, risk, and others are involved. These are sort of like risk, time, and social preferences. So time preferences is kind of like how do you aggregate over time, like today versus tomorrow, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days from now. How do you sort of aggregate these up, right? So you might be happy, you might make a choice today that makes you today very happy, but you regret it in 5 days from now. And the question is kind of like how do you aggregate these sort of like instantaneous utility functions into one big function. Those are sort of time preferences. Risk preferences is like when there's risk involved, when things are uncertain. So if I offer you a lottery, or if you want to play the lottery or the like, if you take certain classes, if you study for an exam or not, these are often risky choices. In a sense, you can do one thing or another. Often you don't know what the outcome might be in various sort of choices that you make in life. And then, often some people are what we call risk averse, to say they avoid risk, and that sort of like affects their choices. And then finally, there's social preferences that you could sort of say social preferences in some sense go into the instantaneous utility function in the sense of like that's just another sort of argument of that function. Or you might say, well, in some sense I care about myself and I care about others, and sort of I'm aggregating my own instantaneous utility and others' instantaneous utility into sort of a larger function overall. But broadly speaking, one part of people's utility constrained optimization is the utility function. Second is people's beliefs. Right? This is kind of like how they believe, what people believe about their environment. When you think about like purchasing things, that would be not usually prices. It would be returns to certain investment. If you take a class versus another, or if you take a major versus another, what does that lead to in terms of like your future earnings, your happiness, and so on and so forth. And then sort of one of that is like essentially your priors. What do you think about the world? And then how do you update your information once I provide you with new information? Right, so there's like some prior beliefs that you have, provide you some new information, and you update it to your sort of posterior beliefs overall. And then sort of when you sort of think about the utility maximization problem as sort of from a mathematical perspective, you might say, well, once I know your preferences and I know your beliefs or your information, I kind of have all the information you need. I can solve for the optimum, and that's kind of how you should behave. But in some sense, the whole problem is like solved for you. So we're sort of like done. But then sort of even conditional on that, people seem to make choices that don't quite fit sort of the classical economics framework, which is kind of like how do people, or the question kind of is, how do people use utility functions in their beliefs to make certain decisions? And do we find sort of certain anomalies or deviations from sort of the perfect utility maximization in a sense of using preferences and beliefs? So there's different things that some influences on behavior aren't just about utility and beliefs. In particular, the issues like, as I talked a little bit about last time, which are frames, default, and nudges, and sort of heuristics. That's to say, like, the way I present a problem to you might affect your choices greatly for given preferences and for given information. That is to say, you might sort of think you like one thing or another, and you have certain information about the returns to these choices, but then the way I present an information or like I set the default, for example, for savings or other sort of choices, people might change, might decide dramatically differently. Sorry. So now what I'm going to do is like essentially take sort of each of these items, essentially first preferences, the utility function, second beliefs, and then sort of like choices and decision making, and show you essentially how using psychological insights might be used to improve people's, so understanding sort of their decision making as a whole, or understand certain choices that people make, and how essentially psychological aspects might affect people's behavior. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is social preferences, is kind of like how do people think about themselves and others. And much of classical economics thinks that people are selfish. They essentially care about themselves and nobody else. Is that a good assumption, or what do you think about that? Yes?
Yeah, I think you can think of it in many ways that eventually leads you to think that someone is selfish. For example, you can say that you value the happiness of other people and that enters your utility function. So I think it depends on what you got of caring about other people and compare it to caring about other people because it makes you happy somehow.
Right. So one thing you're saying is essentially, it's kind of actually tricky to figure out what's selfish and what it's not. It's in some sense, if I'm nice to all of you, it could be that I'm really nice. It could be that I just really care about evaluations or whatever. So in some sense, it's hard to interpret from people what they do in terms of understanding their motives. That's actually a very tricky question in sort of behavioral economics, trying to figure out, are people truly altruistic, or are they sort of doing things for others for ulterior motives? I want to step back a little bit and saying, like, well, overall, sort of the assumption of selfishness is actually a pretty good one. In many situations, when you think about people's choices, usually the choices affect people themselves. When you think about, like, what kind of classes should you choose, what kind of profession do you want to get into, whom you want to marry, and so on, often that's a choice that affects yourself. These are sort of individual choices. People are selfish. Of course, people are not selfish in all respects. But overall, it's actually mostly true. It's actually a pretty good assumption in many situations. Now, what I'm going to talk now about is sort of like, okay, well, in some situations, it's not a good assumption, so we should kind of like amend or think about this a little more broadly. And sort of one way I think about this is sort of to think about charity, like 2% of GDP is sort of spent on charity. I guess it was $373.3 billion in 2015, which is a lot of money. So there's at least some evidence that people seem to be caring about others in some way. Now, one way to think about this is to say you have a utility function that has as an argument other people's either utility or consumption, right? So there's some people say, I'm donating money to somebody in Kenya. I have a utility function that says, okay, this person in Kenya, if that person has higher consumption, that makes me happier. Okay, that's sort of one way to think about this. But there's also sort of broader ways, and we may call that pure altruism in the sense of like, I'm just caring about that person. If that person does better, that makes me happier. But that's probably not the whole story. So what other reasons might people have to give or be nice to others? Yeah?
Warm glow from others knowing you're gay.
Right, so warm glow, can you say more? What do you mean exactly by that?
If other people know that you gave, you can get a warm glow feeling from people knowing that you gave things to other people.
Right. So you're saying sort of two things, I think. One is kind of like warm glow, just sort of feeling good about sort of updating about yourself in some sense. People call that often like self-image or the like, where essentially just you want to be a good person. Somebody asks you, would you like to give money to somebody else? It's not like you actually care about this other person, but you want to sort of maintain your image of being a good person, and it makes you just feel good about yourself, right? You said also something different, which is kind of like you care a lot about what others. So one is about self-image, what you think about yourself. I'm a good person, I give to others, and if somebody asks me, I should probably give. You said something else, which is like other people, I care a lot about what other people think about me. And so usually we think of that as called like social image, which is kind of to say, I care a lot about others' opinions, and if other people think I'm a nice person, giving money sort of helps with that. Mm-hmm. What else? What other motives do we have? Yes? Right. So that's a little bit sort of in some sense semantics in the sense of like if I give money sort of to pay lower taxes, in some sense if I sort of looked at this more carefully, it may look like, and I'm going to show you some evidence of like essentially the fraction of money that's donated to GDP. I'm going to split this up. And there, some aspects in that, for example, if you donate money to Harvard for a building, it's not obvious that's sort of like necessarily altruism as opposed to like you feel just really good about yourself to have the name of your name on a building if you have $100 million or something that's at your disposal. But so you're saying essentially some behaviors that may look altruistic, but in fact they're not, in part because it's sort of just individual optimization. So in some sense, that's more like sort of a misspecification, a misunderstanding of people's motives, which I think surely is in some of the what looks like altruism, which in fact it's not. There was some.
Mm. You could be acting altruistically, but in a sense of trying to ultimately optimize your own gain in aggregate.
Right. So if I can rephrase, we're going to get to this, in fact, in a few lectures on the social preferences, which is to say if you compare societies, in certain societies, for example, if people do things like whaling or the like, essentially if you do occupations where you need cooperation to be successful in your finding food or the like, that might sort of lead to altruism or altruistic behavior. People help each other, not necessarily because they like each other, but essentially it's like necessary to be able to survive, and then that might lead to either sort of like just cooperative behavior as a whole, or perhaps to, in fact, people are in fact nicer to each other. So we'll actually get to that, and that's sort of like essentially exactly as you say, sort of an evolutionary perspective, and saying like, depending on what sort of the social, the incentives are for society, depending on what kinds of professions people do, people might be nicer or less nice to each other because it's sort of necessary to survive or be sort of rich and so on. What else? Yes?
You might have expectations about whether other people will reciprocate that altruism.
Exactly. So there's essentially reciprocity. If I do something really nice to you and then ask you a favor in return, you might not actually want to do that, but you feel so inclined because I've been really nice to you. It's sort of like a thing that we do in society, and reciprocity is really important. Quite related to that is fairness. Right, in some sense, if somebody does something, or if somebody gets paid a lot more than somebody else, you might sort of want to share that with others. Not necessarily because you want to, but it's perceived as unfair, and people are uncomfortable with that. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Sorry.
Empathic distress. So maybe when you observe other people suffering, you kind of take it on as your own suffering.
Yes, exactly. So that's what economists would sort of refer to as an inequity aversion one way or the other. Essentially, sort of seeing inequality or inequity makes people uncomfortable, and that comes in various forms. One form of that would be, as you say, in terms of like in absolute terms, like here, look, here are people, and this is, I study a lot of poverty and development economics. Here's people who are extremely poor. It's sort of either like our moral obligation, or I just feel uncomfortable seeing people suffering. We should help them to get over a certain, up to like a certain standard of maybe reducing, eradicating absolute or extreme poverty. There's a different version of that, which is just to say, inequality is just uncomfortable and unfair overall. But for example, in the U.S., people are a lot richer than, say, in India. Nevertheless, you might want to think you would like to live in like a fair and just society where people at least have a reasonably high living standards that they live on. And then it's sort of like either like a moral or other sort of obligation, and people might give because it might just feel uncomfortable to them. Okay, I think we said all of the things that I have here mentioned, and so there's various sort of questions on like various motives on altruism and why people give and are nice to others. Part of what we're going to discuss when we talk about social preferences is trying to disentangle those different motives. And there's a bunch of different experiments that people have run to trying to learn about like why do people give, what determines altruism, what kinds of circumstances make people become nicer to others, or if you wanted sort of to increase altruism, how would we do that? Yes?
Does caring about others like mean like the general population? Or, like how would they look at it as like caring about your friend or family? Like,
Right.
do you have a direct connection with them?
I think those are very much related. There's a bit of a question overall when you think about your utility function. Usually it's defined for individuals, right? It's essentially you, yourself, how are you doing? There's sort of other views where you say, okay, it's actually the household as a whole, where it's essentially everybody in your household is sort of like a unit, and then you sort of maximize as a whole. There's a bunch of things about like within household conflict and issues that sort of arise, and decision making within household might not be optimal. But you can think of like sort of altruism as like narrowly defined about friends and people that you love, and presumably you have like higher altruism towards those individuals, and then people who essentially are further away, there's less of that, or perhaps other motives. These things are surely related, but they're sort of distinct. I think when you think about like your parents or your family, what do you do for them? Often there's different motives than when you, like for example, say reciprocity, et cetera, seems like a lot more important in some ways, or perhaps pure altruism, as opposed to like, inequity aversion or the like, when you think about poor people across the world. But I think these things are very much related, and the question kind of like is which of those particular elements are more important in different settings. Okay. So then the key questions we're going to ask is like, well, what is the nature of such social preferences, i.e. the motivation and to help and hurt others. We mentioned already most of them, and we're going to try and understand, okay, which of those are important in which settings. And then, so one of them is sort of like what determines and why do people give to others. And a separate question, so it's kind of like broadly speaking, you can think of this as like why are people nice, and what determines to others and why are they doing that, or appear nice if you want. And the second version is like, call that like social influence, is like how does the presence of others affect your behavior and your utility. As in to say, it might be that you care a lot about others, what other people think, or you're very jealous and so on and so forth. That's not about being nice, that's just about your utility might be deeply affected what other people think about you. We're going to talk a little bit about things like Facebook and Instagram, etc. Sort of social media in particular might affect how do you feel about yourself, and social influences might shape people's behavior. Okay, so there, when you think about then like why are people nice, and this is what you were saying earlier about when you think about like where do donations go, I was saying like, well, 2% is given of GDP is given to charity. When you look at some of those charities, for some of those charities, it seems pretty clear that people do that because they want to be nice to others. For other charities, perhaps not so much. And sort of some of the education ones are essentially donations to essentially the sponsor, like a quarterback at your school. It's not clear that this altruism. Other donations, if you give for like health or poverty, I think that's pretty obvious. Okay. Now, what we did in class is so one way to think about social preferences and measure this, a very basic and coarse way of doing that is like what's called the dictator game to measure people's preferences. And it's very simple, and one of the questions we asked you was like, here's if you had $10, you could split it into sort of a hypothetical question in class, actually in lecture 12 or something. We're going to do this at least at some point with real money. the question is like, if you had just $10, what would you do with that $10? How much would you keep for yourself, and how much would you give to somebody else? The other version that we asked you was, or there was two versions of that. One was the recipient is informed about the circumstances of the decision. The other one is the other person might never notice the money is just given anonymously. How can we use that? What can be disentangled potentially from those two choices or options? Like if people choose differently in 1 and 2, what does that tell us? Yeah.
If in one they choose to split it, that might be more of like a social thing because they know that the other person will know, so they might worry that it will reflect poorly on them if they choose too much. But if they answer the same for part 2, then they're a little bit more selfless because that's saying that they would split it evenly whether or not the other person knows.
Exactly. So 2 in some ways, and in some way at least you can think of like some form of like pure altruism in some sense. I would be very happy if you had $10 more on your bank account, even if you never knew. There's no reciprocity. There's no sort of like you knowing or new learning about what I did or didn't do. It's just like I'd be happier if you had more money, and therefore I'm giving it to you. Of course, there's things like self-image and so on are hard to rule out in some sense. Maybe it's not like I'm actually happy about you. I'm just happy about me being happy about you. So there's sort of tricky issues about that. But it's sort of getting close to like a form of like pure altruism. If instead, you learn about that like either explicitly it was me who gave you money, or at least there was somebody else doing it, then that's much more about like the person cares about where the money is coming from and so on. That tells you more about sort of social motives, potentially about the other person, how the other person feels when they get money, how others are treating them, or perhaps how I feel when the other person gets it and so on. Is there a question? No.
I don't agree that it would necessarily have to be about reputational self-image. It could simply be about promoting the idea of giving to others. So if the person would potentially not even realize that there was money coming to them from another individual, then it doesn't serve to promote the idea of altruism. But if it did, the person did know that somebody else was making money, it would serve to promote the idea of altruism.
Mm-hmm.
They could be equally selfless.
Yes.
Even if the amounts are different,
Yeah.
your intention
Yes.
in giving more.
Right. So just to clarify, so in number 2, I think what I'm saying is that's pretty close to sort of pure altruism. In number 1, I'm saying there's sort of other forces at play. One of them is about sort of like people care about what others do. You're saying in some sense it's a version of that and saying like, well, if it promotes altruism in some sense, if I give you money and you learn about that I gave you money and the hope is that you'll give money to others, in some sense you would only do that if you sort of care about others one way or the other, if you learn something from those kinds of actions. But yeah, that's all good. I think I'm just saying like so those kinds of experiments will sort of help us disentangle potentially different motives for giving. This is a little coarse. We can't sort of rule out sort of all sorts of things, but it's sort of clear that in some sense there's something different which has to do with like people caring about others one way or the other in some way. Yeah?
I actually did have a question. Do you think the results would change if you did it with a larger sum of money, like $500 or $1,000 or something? Because like with $10, the difference between like getting $5 versus getting $10 isn't as big. Like that's the difference between like having a nice $5 and like being able to get like 4 bags of chips versus like 2 bags of chips.
Yeah.
If you do it with like $1,000, like the difference between $500 and $1,000 could be the difference between like I don't know, like something larger, like 500 would like maybe pay for food for like a while. But
Yes.
like 1,000 you could like maybe buy like a small car or something with.
Yes, understood. So there's actually 2 questions here. One is I'm asking you hypothetical questions, and you might say all sorts of things, but once I'm actually putting down money and say, here's actually $10, how are you going to behave? So what we're going to do in class, we're going to have some hypothetical choices, then we're going to have some real choices, and look at how that's different. In general, people choose actually pretty similar and hypothetical to real choices. Then what we will not be able to answer in class is how would you choose if I give you $500 because I'd be poor at the end of class. However, there have been some experiments with like bankers and rich people and so on, but actually they gave people like $1,000. And what you see overall is that people's giving behavior in those kinds of experiments actually is quite similar to like smaller sums. I think there may be some differences, and I think there's a huge difference potentially, in particular when you think about poverty in developing or giving in developing countries. There's a huge difference potentially whether you give people people large sums of money that could change their lives, and people could sort of, invest and so on and so forth, as opposed to like very small amounts, or even repeated small amounts. If I give you like $5 every few days for quite a while, that might actually not change things that much, because every small thing feels really small. But instead, if I give you $1,000 right away, you might invest and try to have a better life and so on. So in that sense, I think that's potentially different. When you think about these kinds of experiments, they actually look quite similar in the behavior, at least in sort of lab games. Okay, so now how much do people give? So the strict version, just to be clear, in terms of like the standard model would say, well, people should give exactly 0. If you care only about yourself, why would you give money to others? You just keep everything. Usually, subjects give about $2 to $3. The average giving in class was about $3 in the first case and $2 in the second case. So in some sense, it seems essentially that when the person knows about the circumstance and there's sort of something that's valued more, either being like it signals altruism or just the other person might feel happier, and you sort of appreciate that in some way. And so here is what this looks like. You can sort of see the distribution. A lot of people give either 0 or $5. There's a few of you who give everything. That's very nice. There I do wonder if it's actually, if it was actually $10 real, we would really follow through. But surely there's some really nice people. There's some issues with those kinds of games, in the sense of like, I'm eliciting your behavior in terms of what would you do if I gave you $10 with some other student or some other person that's fairly rich. You could see some people actually saying, I'm giving 0, and instead I'm donating it to somebody, the money to somebody in Kenya. It would look in the lab as if I was really sort of selfish, but in fact, I'm actually altruistic. So there's issues with these kinds of lab experiments. But in general, I think sort of people's behavior in these lab games is fairly predictive of like real-world things that we care about. Yes?
I'm curious about the order in which these questions were asked, because I remember on the survey, we had the question on the left being asked first. And I think my thought process would have been different if I had been asked the questions in the reverse order.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I think in an actual experiment that I or others would run, this would be randomized what the order is, and then we can test for that directly. Or what you would do is you randomize across people. So some people get one question and some people get the others. We haven't done that in part just because otherwise we would have had to send you different links, and it was already chaotic enough to send you like one link, which is seems to be like the most we can handle. And so, but usually what you would do is like essentially you would randomize the order and then be able to do that. My guess is that broadly speaking, the results would be similar qualitatively. There might be sort of like some small differences in terms of the exact numbers. And surely the order of those kinds of questions often matters, which in some sense goes to like what we have in the third aspect of choice, where like, if you think about and then the classical model, the order should surely not matter. Like essentially, I'm giving you some choices. You have a utility function. You have beliefs, and now you'd be done. The order is completely irrelevant. But it turns out that order effects often, in fact, are quite important in experiments, and I think in the real world as well. Yeah.
Is there some way to think about how too much altruism maybe is good? Like if someone gives me $5, I would think really well of them, but if someone gives me $10, they might think they're like really weird or not.
No, that's a great question, in fact. So we do, so a lot of these experiments, and what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is as well, a lot of the experimental evidence that's been collected so far has been collected in rich countries, in Western countries, industrialized countries, rich and sort of educated people. And so the acronym for that is WEIRD. Essentially, which is essentially, think of a lot of experiments that are done with mostly college students in sort of rich universities in the world. And their behavior might not be as so in some sense the hope is that we sort of find universal sort of characteristics or parameters of people's behavior, but it's not unreasonable to think that in other societies people behave quite differently. And for example, one thing that we find in India in part, we do these kinds of games with people, and there sometimes people would say like, well, if I gave too much, or if somebody else did, often we have sort of these games where it's not just one choice but another choice, and if somebody, for example, offers you too much money, the other person reacts and say, this is weird, I can't accept this money because otherwise I would owe them some debt or the like. So there's these kinds of behaviors where, like, in some sense it's more complicated because of other reciprocity or other reasons. In China and other countries, there's a sort of a clearer culture of sort of reciprocity where people are fairly careful, for example, on whom to invite and so on and so forth, and whom to accept presents and so on from, because you know in some sense you have to reciprocate at some point, and if you're not able to do that, that's very bad. So I think that's exactly as you say, it's a lot more complicated in many settings. Yeah?
Sorry, just a quick question about the graphs. What is the y-axis?
It's the density. It's like the sort of it aggregates, it adds up to 1. So essentially it's a fraction. Think of this as like the fraction overall. It's essentially...
Two of them that are greater than 1.
It's the PDF essentially. It sort of adds up to, it aggregates up to 1. So another version of that would be just a fraction of people.
But you can't have a fraction that's larger than 1. I'm confused.
No, this is not the fraction. This is like this is the PDF, right? Yeah, exactly. It's the PDF that essentially aggregates to 1. But you could relabel this and essentially look at the fraction of people. The graph would exactly look the same. Yes, maybe you should just do that. Okay. Okay. So second, let's talk a little bit about time preferences. So one interesting example, and in some sense I think one of the things we'd like to encourage you in behavioral economics or in psychology and economics is look around in the world and think about what's weird or what kind of things in the world can be explained with behavioral economics or things that we see in the world. And here's one example of that, which is just a weird thing if you think about it. So there's this bet that's called, there's a sort of these betting agencies, and one of these bets is where dieters can bet on their own weight loss success, and they often lose. So how does this work? There's like William Hill, which is a sports betting agency, and they offer all sorts of weird bets. And one of them apparently is also some somewhat unusual wagers where people are allowed to bet on their own weight loss, and in fact they do that, but they often lose while doing this. Now, why is this like a weird bet? What's weird about this? Yes?
You have control technically over the outcome of your own weight.
Yes, exactly. So if you had perfect self-control and if you had perfect foresight, in some sense, if you understood kind of like what your preferences are and you have like plans for the next month or two, of course there's like unexpected things that could happen. But if you sort of understood your preferences well and had perfect self-control, you would know that either you can lose weight and then you would win the bet, or you would not lose weight, but then you would not even start the bet in the first place. But here, over 80% of bettors, in fact, lose. So now, how do we think about that? How do we explain sort of this behavior?
Self-control.
Yes?
Self-control problems.
And so, more specifically, what does that mean?
So people always think like, I'll be on diet starting tomorrow, but when tomorrow comes, they do not. So
Right. But there's two things going on potentially. So one is self-control in the sense of like, I have low self-control, I like eating donuts, and I like eating donuts a lot, so I'm not going to lose any weight anytime soon. Can that explain that behavior by itself, or what else do we need? Yes?
part of the answer.
Oh, sorry.
That's part of the answer. The other part is like, okay, I'll stop eating donuts from tomorrow, even though I love it, I want to lose some weight.
Right. Exactly. So what you need is some form of naivete or over-optimism in a sense of saying, like, I know maybe today I know I really like donuts, but tomorrow I'll just eat lots of salad. Right? And sort of in some sense there's this over-optimism and naivete where people are essentially naive about their future preferences, plus there needs to be some form of like self-control problems, and that combination leads to these kinds of bets. So one part is self-control problems. The second part is sort of like an naivete overconfidence. Putting these together could get some people to essentially engage in these kinds of bets. Is there some other motivation why you would engage in this bet? Exactly. So it could be that in some sense so one explanation is like, I think this is a really great deal. Somebody offers me this great deal, I'm just going to lose some weight, I'm going to make a bunch of money, and then afterwards I guess I'll eat a bunch of donuts. So I don't really necessarily need to like want to lose weight. I just think it's a great deal. So that's kind of like overconfidence about my self-control. Then I engage in the bet. It turns out actually I don't have self-control and I lose the money and eat lots of donuts. Now, the second thing that you're saying is, well, actually, I might actually be aware of my self-control problem. So I might actually understand that I have a self-control problem. Now I'm engaging in this bet because, as it turns out, on average, I guess there's a 20% chance of me actually succeeding. And perhaps the bet itself might help me in achieving that goal. So that's essentially some form of a commitment device where engaging in that bet is helping me lose weight. I might actually know, and there's a question of like, are you fully sophisticated or perhaps partially or fully naive? In some sense, I might know that there's a good chance that I might actually lose the money, but it might be worth for me actually engaging in the bet because the expected value of losing weight might be higher than the loss of money overall, right? So I think we said all there's to say here. So essentially, there's either sort of, either people are just overconfident or naive. Second one is people might want to set themselves incentives to lose weight. Again, you need some naivete in a sense of like, or some stochasticity or something. Otherwise, it couldn't be that. Like, otherwise, you would only engage in the bet if you know that it's actually helpful. So it needs to be like some people either sort of it's stochastic or they're sort of partially naive in some sense. They think there's a chance it'll work, but in fact, maybe they overestimate how high the chance of succeeding is. So overall, what this sort of reflects is there's a conflict between short-run and long-run plans. There's actually two things going on. One is kind of like what you want in the short run might be different from what you want in the long run. Second one is like you might have sort of like imperfect foresight about that. Yes?
Were people allowed to bet they would gain weight?
Say that?
Were people allowed to bet they would gain weight?
Actually, don't know. You could try. I actually don't know, but I think that's probably easier to do. I think so. Maybe they wouldn't accept the bets, or like your sort of like quota would be worse. Yeah.
Could there also be a change in utility where you start saying, oh, if I lose 10 pounds, I'll get $500, but over time you're like, oh, eating is actually changing my eating habits is difficult. Oh, like working out is difficult, so now I'd rather pay the $500, but not exactly lose the weight because I'm no longer as interested.
Right. You say in some sense there's sort of some learning uncertainty involved. Yeah, I think that could be the case for some people. You would think, for 80% of people, they kind of know their preferences by now. So a lot of behaviors and have sort of the same issue, like, I'm chronically over-optimistic about when I get up in the morning. Every night I'm sort of like, oh, tomorrow at 7 I'll get up and I sort of exercise and write a poem and so on and so forth. And then, that never happens. So I think while you say there is sort of like potentially sort of uncertainty about the world and you might sort of just not know how hard losing weight is in this example, there's plenty of examples which I'm going to show you is like where people over and over make the same sort of choices that seem to be not optimal, where you think, people should have all the information they need and people should have learned over time. But I think part of that is like some explanation potentially is learning. That's exactly right. Okay, so then what we have then here in our survey, I asked you two questions. One was like, how often do you think you should be exercising? The other one is, how often do you in fact exercise? These actually look quite similar. There seems to be one person who thinks they should, and they actually do exercise 50 times a month, which is very impressive. I don't know whether you were truthful. You know who you are. But so if you sort of plot this against each other, what you essentially see is quite a bit of mass below the 45-degree axis, which is to say there's a bunch of people who say they should be exercising more than they actually do. And that's sort of a typical pattern in the world. Lots of people think in the future they should be doing things or more virtuous things in the future. They would like to be sort of a better, more virtuous, more healthy person than they actually are. So if you had to choose for like next month or next week or the like, you would choose lots of virtuous and good things for yourself. But then, if you had to choose for right now, that might not actually happen. And that sort of leads to this discrepancy between people's desires and their actual behaviors, which we're going to then study and try and understand. And then the broad question there then is to say, well, given that that's the case, do people understand their behavior? Are they sophisticated? And are sort of engaging in certain commitment devices or certain behaviors that might help them overcome those types of issues? So at the source of this conflict is essentially what we call present bias, which essentially is manifested in what we ask you about as well, which is ask you two questions about a choice between $100 in cash and 52 weeks from now versus X dollars in 54 weeks from now. If you think about 52 versus 54 weeks from now, that's really far in the futures, and 2 weeks really earlier or later really don't make a difference. So most people would probably say something like close to like 100. If I instead ask you, like right now, would you like to have $100 versus in 2 weeks from now, a lot more people say they'd rather have the $100 now, or like they essentially like take like a lower amount right now than like $100 in the future. Essentially because like right now they put a lot of weight into the present, the immediate present. And that's what we refer to as like present bias. Essentially people put disproportional, very high weight on the present compared to anything that's in the future. And so when you look at that, it's a little bit noisy, and the question is not quite ideal because in some sense what I really would like to do is ask you about 52 weeks from now and 54 weeks from now, and then wait for a year and then ask you the exact same question again. Now I can't really wait for you to do that. So in some sense the circumstances in a year from now might be quite different from what they are now. You might be richer or like more educated, wiser, and so on. But for what it's worth, it does seem to be the case that when you ask people about $100 in 52 weeks versus 54 weeks from now, the distribution is very close to like 100. Essentially, you don't care very much about whether you get $100 in 52 weeks versus 54 weeks from now. If you look at like $100 now versus $100 in 2 weeks from now, I have to pay you like a higher amount in 2 weeks from now to get you indifferent between now and 2 weeks from now, which is kind of saying like you care more about today versus 2 weeks from now. Your discount rate between today and 2 weeks from now is higher than it is from 52 versus 54 weeks from now. Yeah?
I was wondering how you could distinguish this kind of time preference and kind of expectation of risk. Like, for example, if you offer money now, it's more certain than 2 weeks from now when I will not see you again. But if I look at 52 versus 54, they are both uncertain.
Yes. So just to repeat the question is like, what about risk? So if I ask you $100 now and I give you a $100 bill and say, or some money in the future, who knows whether I'm going to like show up and actually give you the money? And there's reason to be skeptical. I will be here in 2 weeks. Don't worry. But so there's a bunch of experiments that in fact try to deal with that fairly carefully. So they would do things like they give in some experiments with students, they give the professor's office name, they have the phone number, the business card, they even give like checks that are sent automatically. So they're sort of like people try to deal with that. It's a great question. In fact, there's lots of research in that that tries to do that. Some people said, well, this present bias is actually not real that you find in these types of experiments. But then people have been very, very careful in trying to disentangle risk from time preferences. And they find essentially, even if you try to like minimize risk as much as possible in those experiments, present bias seems to persist in those kinds of choices. Yeah?
I'm curious about the reasoning for like being indifferent between $100 now and less than $100.
You have to ask your classmates about that. It could be that in some sense you say, if you, for example, say, you know that you tend to waste money in certain situations. Maybe you're really tired today and you're just going to say, I'm going to waste the money on hamburgers. You might sort of say, maybe in a week from now, things are different. I think there's lots of explanation that you can come up with. Again, you have to ask your classmates and what they were thinking. If anybody has an explanation, please let us know. I think one broad bottom line from this, in these kinds of experiments, you see a lot of behavior that looks kind of, there's lots of potential anomalies. Like there's lots of noise essentially in some of those kinds of data. In aggregate, things often look sort of, the patterns sort of emerge, but there's lots of people make choices that are in fact hard to rationalize. And we're trying to sort of look at sort of aggregate patterns. Well, most of these things are sort of systematic. But there's some people, they're on the very left, maybe these are just mistakes, for example, or they just misunderstood the question, or, there's typos and so on and so forth. Okay, so let me sort of just summarize here. So there's, people tend to be fairly patient for far-off decisions. So in the future, you're actually quite patient between stuff that happens between a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. People invest all sorts of things for the far-away future. But when it comes to immediately relevant decisions, people tend to be quite impatient. You care a lot about right now what happens, the next maybe day or the next few hours. You care a lot about that much more than a week or two or even a year from now. So there's then two broad questions that we're going to look at. One is sort of evidence of those kinds of conflicts between the current and future selves in terms of like short-run desires and long-run goals. And we kind of try and find evidence of that. Second, we're going to look at like whether and how people predict their future utility and behavior. And that's sort of a general pattern in behavioral economics or in psychology and economics, is to say, actually, the fact that people are present bias itself is not a huge problem in the sense of like causing like sort of welfare losses or making people unhappy, as long as people are sophisticated. So as long as I know I have self-control problems and I'm fully aware of them, I can sort of set my decision environment or my choices such that I can actually sort of mitigate a lot of these biases. In part because I can buy certain commitment devices, I can sort of like set alarm clocks and all sorts of things that might sort of help me improve my behavior. The problem comes from like naivete. And then to say, if I have self-control problems and I'm naive on top of that, then I might get really screwed because I think, oh, I'm going to go do stuff in the future, I'll do it in the future, and so on. And then the future comes, and surprise, I'm like really still have like, I'm still present bias and have like self-control problems. So if I sort of think that I have more self-control than I actually have, that might cause a lot of like bad behaviors or problems because I make sort of mistakes that are then hard to fix in the future. That's sort of a general pattern about behavioral economics. Similar issues like, for example, if you think about memory, if I have imperfect memory, that's of course potentially a problem, but I can sort of fix it in some sense. Like I can set myself reminders, I can help sort of other people have them remind me and so on. I can set my decision environments that like I can account for sort of imperfect memory. The problem comes if I'm overconfident. If I sort of think I can remember everything, I talk to people, never take notes, and say, yeah, I'll remember. But then, like, an hour later, I've forgotten everything. That really leads to problems. And again, it's sort of like, it's not the sort of the bias itself in terms of having sort of imperfect cognitive function or the like, but rather sort of the overconfidence of the same that often leads to welfare losses or sort of making people unhappy or making sort of inferior choices. Okay. So let me talk about beliefs then for a bit. So a broad set of like beliefs or, sorry, was there any other questions about preferences? Yes?
Yeah, for present bias, is it in general symmetrical compared to loss versus gain? So do people prefer to lose in the future rather than to lose now? And like, is it kind of symmetrical in general?
Yeah, we'll talk about that, in fact. Sort of in some sense, people tend to, so essentially people like to have gains in the future and gains in the present and future losses in the future, right? In some sense, think about it like this, you put more weight on the present utility than you put on the future utility. Well, how do you do that? Well, you want to have more gains and fewer sort of losses or negative things going on. That is not to say that like loss aversion always happens. So loss aversion as a concept of like gains and losses, you're loss averse in the present and you're also loss averse in the future. But if you sort of could pick, would you rather have like a gain in the present or a gain or loss in the present versus in the future? You would tend to say I'd rather have the gain now and the loss in the future, precisely because you overweight essentially the present period or utility. I don't know if that, but we'll talk about that, yeah. Okay, so let me talk about now beliefs and sort of like information updating. So one sort of very basic question that I think we ask you, and that's sort of like a classic question that like people like Kahneman and Tversky and so on would often ask, which is sort of essentially the question, suppose 1 in 100 people have HIV. We have a test for HIV that's 99% accurate. This means that if a person has HIV, the test returns a positive result with 99% probability. And if a person does not have HIV, it returns a negative result with 99% probability. If a person's HIV test came back positive, what's the probability that she has HIV? Now, that's a very straightforward question that there's a clear, correct answer. If you know Bayes' rule, you can essentially just calculate that. I'm sure somewhere in statistics, et cetera, people have taught you that. Now, 22% of this class sort of answered 99%. That's usually sort of the classic, what's called like base rate neglect. For what it's worth, you guys are much better than previous years. I don't know why that is, but maybe people get smarter over time. But still, this is sort of MIT. If sort of 20% of MIT students get this wrong, surely the fraction in the general population who gets that wrong is a lot higher. And sort of the typical sort of explanation is that there's sort of like what's called base rate neglect. Probably sort of the logic is something like this, like a positive person will probably receive a positive result. If she's tested positive, she's likely to be HIV positive, and sort of then that's sort of 99%. Now, that's sort of a very sort of natural and sort of easy answer. In particular, if you only had like 5 or 10 seconds to answer this question, that's sort of a natural response many people would make. Usually, the fraction of people who would say 99% would be a lot higher. It would be like maybe half or more. In previous years, I think it was about half. And very few people, in fact, would give the correct answer of 50%. And sort of the mistake here is essentially what's called sort of base rate neglect. Is sort of to ignore the fact that, in fact, the population, the base rate is, in fact, very low. It's only 1%. And you should sort of condition on that when you sort of try to solve this problem. So here's sort of what you see. So 50 is the correct answer, if I remember right. But like, there's lots of spread around this. And the fraction of people who get it right is maybe like 50% or even lower than that. So now, in some sense, you can sort of look at this and look, and the answer is like 50%. The key part here is not like, is this a specific problem and some people maybe misunderstood and so on and so forth. The point here is that this is actually a fairly basic problem in terms of like probability theory. This is like a very simple problem to solve in a sense of like, if you think about like what real problems do you need to solve in the world is way more complicated than that. However, even among MIT students, like something like half of the students, when given like several minutes at least to think about this, and I don't know how much time you took, but when given quite a bit of time to think about it, get the answer wrong. That means essentially in many other decisions you have to act much faster. People don't think about these things that much. People have not taken statistics. People have not taken math and so on. And so the fraction of people who would sort of get these very basic problems is probably much higher, let alone sort of much more complicated problems. So broadly speaking, these problems are hard. Often what we sort of do when we have cognitively demanding tasks, we tend to have sort of quick and intuitive shortcuts. In some sense, think about sort of the problems that are really hard. We try to sort of simplify and make it easier for us. We give sort of intuitive answers to those types of questions. These intuitive answers are actually often not bad. They're actually pretty close in many situations, but often they sort of systematically lead to incorrect answers. And they sort of essentially then, there's a whole field of essentially cognitive psychology and so on that tries to think about essentially what kind of biases arise. And in particular, Kahneman and Tversky, who Danny Kahneman is sort of a psychologist who got the Nobel Prize in economics, with sort of their experiments, and you may have read sort of Thinking Fast and Slow, with their experiments, they essentially demonstrated a large number of those kinds of anomalies and biases in people's cognition, if you want, in terms of like heuristics that they use for these kinds of probability and other problems. And these are sort of systematic biases. These are not sort of random mistakes that are sort of added to people's choices. People systematically, in systematic ways, deviate from sort of optimal choices or optimal correct calculations. And the question then is, can we sort of like understand these systematic biases better and then sort of try to explain behavior systematically? And if we sort of understood these mistakes better, well, then we could sort of potentially fix the mistakes and sort of improve people's decision making. Okay. There's another question that worked reasonably well, but it's sort of, in some sense, MIT is a little bit of a special population, which is the question of overconfidence. And that's a little bit hard to elicit with a simple survey. So what we're asking you about, like, what's the probability of you yourself would earn, like, a lot of money versus what's the probability of what students in your class would make this type of money. Now, if you sort of think about these two questions, at least under some assumptions, they should add up to the same number. So essentially, everybody, if you aggregate over everybody, if people's expectations are correct, that should add up to the same number, at least under some assumptions. Usually, they do not. The difference is actually relatively small. MIT is like a little bit of a special population in a sense. Like if you look at like surveys across the world, for example, if you think about like driving behavior in the world, something like 95% of drivers think they're better than the median driver. Lots of people think they're better than smarter than the median person, and so on. There's lots of evidence of overconfidence in the world. So MIT, to some degree, has actually an opposite issue, which is like underconfidence. When you look at like student surveys at MIT, there's quite a bit of evidence that essentially, and I'll show you this in fact in class, about like the typical MIT student sort of thinks they're like worse than the average MIT student. So there seems to be here some overconfidence here, but it's in fact not particularly strong. So there you can sort of see there's like some over and underconfidence. Perhaps there's a little bit of overconfidence here, but in fact it's fairly weak. But overall, as a pattern in the world, there seems to be quite a bit of overconfidence in many situations. And then the question is, does overconfidence lead to sort of bad outcomes? If you're overconfident about certain situations, well, then you're going to fail a lot because you sort of do stuff that is too difficult for you. If you're underconfident, you might not sort of engage in certain behaviors and sort of not try things that would be good for you. In fact, Maddie, who's currently traveling, one of your TAs, had some very interesting work in India about women being underconfident and thus sort of not trying to convince their household members or their husbands and so on to try and work in the labor market. That leads to sort of lower labor supply earnings and so on and so forth. So if you're sort of underconfident, you might not try certain things that might be good for you. And then the problem is if you never try it, you might actually never learn about it, right? If you never even try it yourself, then you might never even fail or learn that you might be actually able to do that. So there are these potential traps of like underconfidence, or if you're overconfident, you might just fail because you try things that are actually not good for you. And then there's sort of other issues about motivated beliefs. I discussed this already last time, which is the idea that you might be overconfident, not because you actually necessarily believe or deeply believe sort of like what you like to believe, but in fact because it just makes you feel good about the world, about yourself. So I might not actually, if you really ask me like I'm a better driver than the median driver, I might not actually sort of necessarily, if you make me think about it, I might actually agree that that's not the case. But, you know, I like to think about I do things well, so in some sense I might sort of just say yes because it makes me feel good about myself. So essentially, overconfidence could be driven by motivated beliefs, and that's sort of another topic that we're going to try and study. Okay. Okay, so then, now, as I said, you know, there are preferences and beliefs that we study. So in some sense, you know, preference is about what you want, beliefs is about what you think the world is like. Now, putting these together, as I said, people's choices should be entirely determined. But that tends to be not the case. And sort of one classic survey that's a survey question or like a version of a survey question that Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize recently in economics, has sort of asked a bunch of people, which is the following. The question is, imagine that you're about to purchase an iPad for $500. The salesman tells you that you can get the exact same good in a nearby location for $15 off. You would need to walk for 30 minutes. In total, would you go to the other store? Okay? So you look at this question. Well, if an economist looks at this, the question is like, okay, there's some cost of walking. It's tedious to walk. Maybe it's raining, maybe not. And then you have some value of time. Either your value of time is like for 30 minutes is below or above $15. If the answer is your value of time is higher, you're not going to walk. If your answer is the value of time is lower, you're going to walk. Case closed, you're sort of done. And you know your preferences, you know you have all the information you need. Now I'm asking you like a related question, which is in fact the exact same questions if you think about it, except for what's different is like it's about an iPad versus an iPad case. I'm asking you the exact same question, which is the question about would you walk for half an hour for $15? So again, either your value of time is above or below $15 for 30 minutes. If the answer is yes, you should say, if your value of time is higher, you should say no to both questions. If the value of time is lower, you should say yes to both questions. But notice here, the questions are exactly the same. The only thing that's changing is essentially the value of the item. Now, why might people still say different things, or what's potentially affecting behavior here? Yes? Yes, exactly. So we're thinking in relative terms, which is to say the $15 seems kind of pretty small when it comes to when it compares to $500. That's to say $500 is a lot of money. So if you spend $500, you might as well sort of whatever the $15 more or less. It doesn't really matter. But when you spend 30, like 15 is like half of that. Like, you know, it's like a lot of money. So you get like $15 off. That would be like a really great deal to get. But when you think about sort of now going back, and this is, I guess, when you go back to like recitation, look at utility maximization, there's no place for like these relative considerations. When you maximize utility, it would be like the utility of like there's potentially consumption items and so on. These are all in absolute terms, and either money makes you happy or not, or walking makes you unhappy. There's no relative comparison here overall. Yet what seems to be really important is these relative concerns. And when you look at this question, this is, I think, one of the questions that's the most robust I've found in any of the surveys I did. This always works essentially. People are much more likely to, or say at least they're much more likely to walk for an iPad case than they are for an actual iPad. There's various reasons why you might say, well, in this case, maybe if you have an iPad, you buy an iPad for $300, whatever I said, you might have a lot more money, and so you're richer, and so on and so forth, so maybe that can explain the results. There's like 10 different versions of these questions that all sort of like have different flavors, and essentially this result is extremely robust. People tend to think in relative terms and not in absolute terms when making these kinds of choices, and their choices are extremely malleable to sort of kinds of like comparisons. Any questions about that? Yeah.
How about joint evaluation? So if you were to ask people whether you would buy this iPad, you get the $15 off, and also for the same iPad case, you get $15 off. And if you go there and buy both, you get a total of $30 off. So do you think the same behavior to like walk would replicate in that?
I think what people in some ways do in their heads, they do essentially is like what fraction do you get off in some ways. And if you then bought both, I guess that would be I don't know what the prices were. It would be like, I guess, $530, and then you get like I think it would probably be somewhere in between. It would be, the behavior would probably be quite similar to the iPad thing overall, because you would have like, I think what people do in their mind is to say, I'm spending already X dollars in case like 500 or 530. Now, does the 15 look large or small compared to that? 15 looks really large compared to 30, so let's just walk, and I might as well do it and get a really good deal. I get like 50% off. When you have like 500 or 530, the 15 seems really small. That's not really a great deal, so why bother doing it? Let's just spend it all anyway. But of course, the issue is like $15 or $15, and you're going to use that $15 for something else, presumably not just iPads, and then you should give essentially the same answer. There's some very interesting evidence I'm going to show you at the very end of the class, which is about poor versus rich people. So there's some evidence that Senthil Muruganathan and Anu Shah and others have done that do exactly these kinds of relative thinking comparisons with rich people and with poor people. And what you find there overall is that rich people do this a lot, poor people actually not so much. And why is that? No, it's like for the same amount. They keep the amounts the same.
They value it a lot more than rich people.
Right. So they value it more. Yes, that's right. And yeah.
Because rich people have more money, they can more afford to like spend less time thinking about the $15, and therefore might make like more of a snap judgment. While poor people might like deliberate about it for like a minute.
Right. So exactly. So in some sense, like, so there's two different explanations. One is kind of sort of very, in a way, like classical explanation is to say there's certain amounts of money that for the rich it just doesn't matter. Like if you like have $1 million, like why walk anyway and whatever, I just don't pay attention. And in some sense I make then certain mistakes, but the mistakes are really sort of like not very costly. It's just I don't really care. I might sort of make mistakes, but it's really sort of like not an issue because I'm rich anyway. There's another view on that is to say, well, for the poor, they really, at a daily basis, they evaluate something like $15 or $15. For the poor, they know what $15 is worth. For them, it's like not a comparison to $500, whatever. $15 is like a meal for your family. It's about the difference between your child being hungry versus getting food, or and so on. So then for them, like $1 is $1, and they're less sort of affected by these kind of framing and other choices. But that's sort of one of the most interesting evidence in sort of in poverty research, where people essentially try to understand how do people's monetary choices, or how are they affected by sort of these framings. And sort of the view overall is that the poor might in fact be more rational in some sense, in the sense of like less sort of swayed by framing and other sort of choices that might sort of like lead to a weird or to inconsistent choices, while the rich do that a lot more. The downside of that seems to be that, like, thinking a lot about money, the poor then spend a lot of sort of cognitive energy on sort of thinking about these monetary issues, and that might lead you to sort of make worse decisions in other domains of life. You might have just like less cognitive function or sort of cognitive energy, if you want, available, or resources available for other potentially important choices in life. And that's kind of what we talk about sort of in the poverty development section. Okay. Then there was another choice that we did that usually tends to work, and it was just a very sort of interesting line of research by Darieli and others, which essentially is about anchoring. In some sense, looking at this ex post, I think the questions were not quite right. So the idea of anchoring is to say, if I set you like a very arbitrary anchor by sort of let you think about certain numbers. In this case, it was like the sum of like people's phone numbers, then essentially when you have a high sum of phone numbers, you're willing to pay more. If you have a low sum of phone numbers, you're willing to pay less. There's a bunch of experiments actually done at MIT with MBA students mostly, I have to say. But MBA students mostly, where Dana Ariely, who used to be a faculty member at MIT, did a bunch of these kinds of experiments where essentially you can anchor people fairly arbitrarily. And sort of if you make them think about the last 2 digits of their social security number, if that social security number is high, they're willing to pay more for wine than if the social security number is low. And there's also real choices that tends to be quite robust. One problem with the experiment that we're doing here that didn't seem to like show up. So in 2017, there was more anchoring. Here it doesn't seem like maybe it's upward sloping, maybe not. One problem here is that the anchor, if you look at like the values of the anchor that we were setting, they're actually pretty low. Right, there's essentially between something like 10 and 30, while people's valuation tends to be often a lot higher, so maybe that's why potentially it didn't work. It could be that you guys are less prone to anchoring, but overall I think sort of the bottom line is there's quite a bit of evidence essentially that when you anchor people, that affects their choices. And again, of course, it shouldn't affect your choice at all. When I make you think about your social security number or large or small numbers, that shouldn't by no means affect like how much you're willing to pay for a glass of, for a bottle of wine or anything else. Yet there's sort of like a relatively robust line of research that shows that, in fact, that's the case. And for example, it seemed like at least in 2017, that was in fact going on. Finally, I want to talk something sort of briefly, which is a quite interesting sort of literature in social psychology. And it's this paper by Darley and Batson, which is like sort of like a classic study in psychology that studies helping behavior. And broadly speaking, you think of social psychology perhaps as a way of thinking about how do social circumstances or your sort of like your environments affect your behavior or your preferences. And that's sort of like a deviation from what economists think about. Usually economists would say, well, you have certain preferences. You either want to be nice or not, or you either want to eat certain things or not. It shouldn't sort of depend that much on like your social environment. And social psychology studies in detail kind of like how your choices or behaviors, in this case, I guess, helping behavior, is affected by your environment. And so what they did is like they study helping behavior. These are Princeton theology students on their way to a seminar. And they pass an ostensibly injured man slumped in a doorway, coughing and groaning. This is like somebody in the experiment. So social psychology studies are very sort of rich in sort of like creating interesting environments. So they had like this man who essentially is looking very injured. And they were looking at determinants of helping behavior. So the question is, do these theology students stop and help this man when they're on the way to their seminar? And they had 3 different sort of manipulations. I should say very clearly there's sort of like a very small sample alert, like the study is very small. So there's some questions on does this replicate, which is often for several social psychology studies, sort of classic studies, sample sizes are relatively small. So there's some questions on how does it replicate, but I think the point, broadly speaking, is sort of a good one, which is why I'm telling you about this. So what are the 3 manipulations? They had 3 things. One was they had a lecture on the parable of the Good Samaritan versus some other content. What is the Good Samaritan parable? Yes?
About helping someone in need on the side of the road.
Exactly. So it's about essentially this person who, long story short, there's a person in need on the side of the road. There's sort of like people who are from the same area, the priests and so on. Nobody is helping because they're really busy and so on. And then the Samaritan comes who's like an outcast in society and so on. And he's helping. And the point is sort of like you should help anybody and so on, regardless of background and so on and so forth. So the whole story is essentially saying like you should be helping somebody. So like there are these students now who have been essentially, they've been thinking about this parable, they've been thinking about helping behavior, they're sort of supposed to like give essentially a lecture about the parable of the Good Samaritan. In their mind is that they think about like you should be helping others. So we kind of, determine their mindset and then in fact they sort of see the practical sort of version of that in life. The question is, does that affect behavior? The second variation is like variation in time pressure. Is just like, are people in a hurry or not? And the third one is sort of like personality measures, in particular of sort of religiosity. So people are more or less religious, and you might think that that also affects or determines how much people are helping. So now like you can sort of look at like which of those three things matters for behavior. Who thinks like one is most important? What about 2? 3? Okay, I sort of set this up in some sense, maybe not in the right way. So it turns out 2 is, in fact, and as you sort of said, is the most important thing. The hurry condition, essentially, again, it's a small sample, but in no hurry, about like 60% of people stopped. Medium hurry, 45%. If people in a high hurry, essentially nobody stops. People essentially, for whatever reason, they're worried about coming late to their seminar, about the Good Samaritan, and they're not sort of particularly good Samaritans themselves. It turns out that personality characteristics don't seem to really predict behaviors. And so what we learned from that is that that situations can matter a great deal. Now, in some sense, that's very much consistent with what I was saying to you earlier about like social influences affect behavior in some sense, in the sense of like, you care about others in a way depends a lot on like your circumstances in the sense of like are you observed or not, or like it's sort of malleable by situations. But I think since here's like a choice that's exactly the same choice. Like you might either be nice or not, but in some sense for the value of time seems to be quite important here for people. So like people's choices in some sense might actually be, it's not like you're a nice person versus not, but in some situations you might behave very nicely and friendly, and in others not so much. And that's sort of a much more sort of fundamental problem perhaps for economics or for writing down utility functions, because essentially the issue is that it's not even clear what your social preference parameter is. It's not even clear, are you a nice person or not a nice person, because it depends so much on like your environment, and people are shaped by their environments overall. So one thing we're going to think about towards the end of the class is to say, well, it's not just that their preferences or their beliefs sort of systematically deviate in ways that we can quantify from the classical model, but in fact it's the case that they're actually very volatile and maybe even hard to elicit in some ways because they're sort of changing so much. And in fact, people might not even know necessarily their preferences, or their preferences are just sort of malleable in the sense of like they depend a lot on circumstantial situations. Okay, so then let me sort of summarize quickly of what we discussed. So I think one way, and this is what I was saying earlier, one way to think about this class is one goal of this class is sort of like really to get you to think more and observe the world more in a way through the lens of economics, but also through the lens of sort of psychology and economics. That's to say, you can think about like a lot of situations how people behave and try to understand why they behave in the ways that they do. And you often sort of see certain puzzles or certain behaviors that don't look quite right. It seems like people are sort of making mistakes in some ways. They seem to be sort of erratic in various ways. But often we can actually put a lot of structure in their behavior. We can actually understand systematically through certain puzzles or through certain theories or certain topics that we discuss in class what people do and why they do that. There's also similar issues about like firms. When you get like credit card offers, when you think about like a sales item and so on, when you think about like pricing decisions that firms make, a lot of these pricing or decisions that firms make are actually thinking very carefully about the psychology of consumers. So essentially what firms are doing, they're trying to think about sort of potential, what we call behavioral biases, so issues that consumers have. And when you sort of think about what you see in the world, often that makes actually a lot of sense through the lens of sort of psychology and economics or behavioral economics. So you can sort of think about yourself or others. When you see certain products, think about sort of how does this relate to the content of the course that we have. And I think that's a general sort of lesson. So what we try to do in the course in part is think about individual choices and sort of some theories in economics and psychology, but in particular, and think about like how do these theories then relate to like real-world outcomes? How can we perhaps apply them to situations in the world and potentially improve choices? So here's sort of like broadly where we are. As I said, we're going to talk about preferences for the next sort of few weeks, in particular time preferences and self-control. As I said, a lot of that is to do with procrastination, including for problem sets. As I said, the problem set will come probably something around Monday. Here's the reading for next week. This is on the course website. Please read Frederick et al. 2002, sections 1, as well as 4.1 to 5.1. Thank you very much.